Welcome to World Talk Brief.
Today we're breaking down the incredibly high-stakes direct talks between the U.S. and Iran. They're happening right now in Oman, and there are very real fears this could all boil over into a direct military conflict that could consume the entire Middle East.
And the situation on the ground? It is incredibly tense. The U.S. has moved thousands of troops and what President Trump himself called an armada into the region. So you've got an aircraft carrier, other warships, fighter jets, all right there, within striking distance. Iran's response? They've made it crystal clear they'll hit back hard if attacked, putting both American forces and its ally, Israel, on high alert.
And it's not just about the hardware. The words being thrown around are just as fiery. You have President Trump openly threatening to bomb Iran if these talks fail. I mean, talk about putting pressure on the negotiators before they even sit down at the table. It really shows you just how tough the administration's position is right now.
So you might be asking, how in the world did we get here? How did we get to this breaking point? Well, the path to these emergency discussions has really been one crisis after another.
And things have escalated fast. Think about it. Just last year, you had a war between Israel and Iran that ended with the U.S. bombing Iran's main nuclear sites. Then, only last month, the regime in Tehran brutally crushed huge protests at home. And that crackdown is what led the U.S. to move its military into the region, which brings us right up to today's meeting in Oman.
And when we say that crackdown was brutal, we mean it. Human rights groups have confirmed, get this, more than 6,800 deaths. And they're warning the real number could be way, way higher. Not to mention the tens of thousands who were arrested. You have to understand, this kind of intense pressure from inside the country is a huge reason why Iran is even willing to talk right now.
So yeah, Iran's leaders are coming to this negotiation from a really weak spot. I mean, they're juggling a terrible economy, massive protests, and a very real military threat on their doorstep. A lot of experts are saying this is probably the most vulnerable the regime has been since the revolution back in 1979.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. Now let's take a look at who's actually in the room trying to pull this all back from the brink.
Right, so this is definitely not a low-level meeting. The U.S. sent some heavy hitters, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And from the Iranian side, you've got their foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi. When you send officials this senior, it tells you one thing. Both sides know just how serious this is.
And the meeting is happening in Oman, which makes a lot of sense. It's neutral territory, and it's been the spot for these kinds of sensitive talks before. You know, this is actually the first time U.S. and Iranian officials have met face-to-face since the war last June. The hope is that even if they don't solve everything, they can at least build some kind of framework for future talks to stop another conflict from happening.
But, and this is a big but, building that framework is not going to be easy. Not at all. Because right now the two sides are starting worlds apart. They have completely different ideas about what should even be on the table.
And here's the biggest disagreement. It's really about the scope of the talks. The U.S. wants to talk about everything. The nuclear program, of course, but also Iran's ballistic missiles, its support for proxy groups in the region, even its human rights record. Iran, on the other hand, is saying, nope, we're only here to talk about the nuclear program. They see everything else as an unacceptable breach of their sovereignty.
And that whole issue with regional groups, that's a huge sticking point. Tehran has a name for this network. They call it the Axis of Resistance. But for the U.S. and its allies, this alliance is seen as one of the main reasons the region is so unstable.
And this network, it's really spread out all over the Middle East. We're talking about powerful groups like Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as militias in Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen. See, for Iran, these groups are how they project power and influence beyond their own borders. So you can see the problem, right? The very thing the U.S. wants to dismantle is what Iran sees as a critical piece of its entire foreign policy.
So what's in it for Iran? Why are they even here? Well, it's all about the economy. They're expected to demand that the U.S. lift those crushing economic sanctions in exchange for any concessions at all. But the flip side is that opponents of the regime are worried. They say that lifting sanctions would just be a lifeline for the leaders in Tehran, giving them the cash they need to consolidate their power.
Okay, let's pull back for a second and look at the big picture. What does all this really mean for everyone involved? Well, the stakes could not be higher.
For Iran's leaders, who are already dealing with so much trouble at home, these talks might just be their last chance to avoid a U.S. military strike. An attack could totally destabilize a regime that's already on shaky ground. So for them, this is a potential path away from the edge of the cliff.
And for the U.S., well, if they can actually get a deal, it's a much-needed off-ramp for them, too. It would let the president de-escalate from military threats while still addressing key security concerns.
Plus, it would be a huge relief to U.S. allies in the region who are terrified of getting caught in the middle of a wider, more chaotic war.
You know, a quote from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio kind of sums it all up perfectly. He basically said he's not sure a deal is even possible, but that there's no harm in trying to find out. And that's really the feeling here. A whole lot of doubt, but also the realization that if they don't try, the alternative might just be war. So I guess the big question we're all left with is, can these two long-standing adversaries find enough common ground to pull the region back from the brink? Subscribe to World Talk Brief for more clear, thoughtful explanations. World Talk Brief, news explained without the noise.